Thanks very much for that nice introduction, and it's a pleasure to be in Dublin and to be speaking at this inaugural conference. It's all very exciting. So I'm going to talk about FAIR and the UK's approach. I'm going to concentrate mainly on England, but also my other colleagues from the other nations were very involved in this work too. Oops, anything worked? No? Doesn't seem to be moving.
No, it's on the laptop in front of you.
Oh, so I'm not using... No, okay, right, okay, fair enough. Okie doke, right. So I've got no conflicts of interest. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview. I'm going to talk about some history to really donor selection and how we got to where we got to with FAIR. Talk about the evidence to support the change, and then go on and talk a bit more about implementation and what we know post-implementation, and hopefully some reassurance. So just a bit of background about the UK and really demographics for donation. So as you can see, really NHSBT is the largest blood donation collection of the 4 UK nations, but in all nations we have a similar percentage of regular donors, and certainly in England we have around 800,000 donors who donate around 1.5 million donations every year. And also we also have now recently started collecting plasma for the first time as well. So when we're thinking about trying to reduce the risk of transfusion-transmitted infections, obviously donors are crucial to this, as well as donation testing. And it's really important that donors are given sufficient information prior to donation, and they really understand why we are asking them lots of questions about their health and behaviours. And the aim around this is to select that low-risk population. And of course, then the next step is donation testing to exclude those donors that are reactive on a range of tests. We've already heard today about donation testing, and in the UK we have a slightly different approach to in Ireland, because we do carry out both serology and NAT testing, but our NAT testing is carried out in pools of, usually pools of 24. So that's the donation testing site, and then occasionally we'll get reports of suspected transfusion-transmitted infections, which we'll follow up and investigate. I think key to understanding all this is really the surveillance that underpins it. So we do have data across the UK, both on post-donation information for those donors who have markers of infection. Also over the years, some data on our healthy donors, which I'm going to talk a bit about. Our donation testing data, which we regularly review and we publish yearly. And also we contribute to SHOT serious hazards of transfusion. And we calculate residual risk to try and work out, based on epidemiology and the window period of infection, so that time between acquiring an infection becoming apparent, using that data to work out what the current risk of us not detecting an infection is. Okay, so in the UK, blood safety is, some parts of blood safety and donor selection guidelines are overseen by the Joint Professional Advisory Committee, which is kind of the 4 UK blood services, and other issues which are often related to things with a big cost attached to them, some reputational things, some issues that are in the BSQR and the EU directive will go to SABTO, so this is the Department of Health Expert Committee on the Safety of Blood Tissues and Organs. And traditionally, any changes that have been related to sexual behaviours, things like tattoos, piercings, have always gone to SABTO for recommendations before then SABTO put these recommendations forward to government. So if we go back to the beginning, so as you're probably all aware, the deferrals around men who have sex with men were put in place in the 1980s when HIV was first identified. And really there hadn't been many changes at all to those deferrals and the deferrals for other higher risk behaviours. So in the early 2000s, the predecessor to SABTO looked at the information to see whether they could recommend any changes. And they said that there really wasn't enough data on compliance. So So they asked Royal London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to carry out some research looking at donors as a whole, and then specifically men who have sex with men, to work out really whether there were people coming forward to donate who were not eligible. So they did a survey of around 10,000 men, did some qualitative and quantitative work, and it was apparent that about 2.5% of men were donating when they shouldn't have been donating. And there was also quite a lot of qualitative data about what would be the ideal deferral period. So in 2011, a recommendation was made to change what was then the permanent deferral to a 12-month deferral. And the permanent deferral was kept in place for commercial sex workers because there just wasn't enough evidence to recommend that change. And there were also some additional changes made for tissues and cell donors. But key to this really was evaluating that change, and really loud and clear coming across was trying to understand more about donor behaviour and donor compliance, so that they actually understand donor selection rules and that they fully disclose any possible risks. So the next bit of the story really was the blood donor survey, and if people can actually see the picture, they might spot an ex-colleague of theirs. So this was really to try and understand more about donors who didn't have any infections, because we realised we didn't really know that much. Anyway, we approached this with an anonymous, unlinked online questionnaire, which was hosted by what was then the Health Protection Agency. We asked lots of questions to try and understand whether donors were complying with the rules. We also asked about post-donation events and illness, why they were coming to donate blood, and also we asked them what they thought of the donor health check at the time. So we had really good response. We had about 65,000 donors who responded, and within that we had 253 who were men who had sex with men. And a smaller proportion of those men had donated in the last 12 months, so weren't compliant to the donor selection guidelines. But overall, we had really high compliance, and also it showed that donors were happy to disclose information of a personal nature, and also from a broad range of donors. And we also realised that our compliance was quite high, and that also enabled us to ask all sorts of random questions about travel. We also asked about people who had pets, so it kind of just set us up for the future when we wanted to do further surveys as well. So by now we've had lots of data on our donors with infections, lots of donors, lots of information about our healthy donors, and really to try and put that together for the next step. And really around this time, lots of other blood services, so Australia, Canada, the US, were also looking at their donor behaviours. And I think everybody was coming to the conclusion that really the donor selection is important, but ultimately it's whether donors are actually understanding that. That is a key issue. So we're nearly up to date now. So the last big review that SABTO undertook was in 2016. And for once, this just wasn't about sex, this was about other things. So in there also included donors at increased risk of infection. So we also included tattoos, injecting drug use. Some of these things we knew legally we wouldn't be able to change because of the EU directive, but a decision was made to review them all at the same time, and also to look at both blood and also tissues. And this time around, there was a group representing a range of opinions. So we had recipients, we also had some of the lobby groups there. And the approach taken was to use the ABO risk decision-making framework. So it was looking at risks, looking at health economics, social context, ethics, and also the residual risks I mentioned earlier. We were kind of using that to work out what was the current risk, and what would be, even in our worst case scenario, if we made the change to a 3-month deferral period, would that be more than 1 in a million risk? Which on our calculations we worked out that it wouldn't. And so the recommendation was made to SABTO to move to a 3-month deferral, both for men who have sex with men, for commercial sex workers. Our recommendations for tattoos and piercing were rejected by the government, so we weren't able to make any changes to those, but we were able to introduce the 3-month deferral. So that's kind of where we got to. And I think we all realised that we were kind of at the limit of where we could go with time-based deferrals, really, because at that point it was basically twice the longest window period for Hep B, plus a bit more. So really the next step was to look more at a behavioural approach. And almost as soon as we got that 3-month deferral in, the government was saying, actually specifically to the blood services, not via Sabto, that we should look towards a more individualised risk assessment. But obviously we'd only just put this in place, and we didn't want to do that until we had some evidence that it was working and there wasn't any unintended consequences. So we kind of hung off a bit until we had our 1 year of data. At that point, it was clear there'd been no impact on safety. And so we did get quite a small group of us together to just have a think how we might be able to do this. So, and some of the things really to think about was how could we do this? Would it be effective? How could we make it specific? Were we really just going to go for men who have sex with men, or were we going to have included all donors in this? And I think key thing that everybody was really worried about was, would this be acceptable, both to donors but also our staff who are going to have to talk with donors about some of these questions that could be pretty personal. And also because in England and at that time and across most of the UK at that time, we had paper-based donor health checks, whether really we'd be able to do that, and we weren't at that point in a position to go online. And so we decided, yeah, we're going to give it a go. And at that point, we put together this big team. And one of my colleagues came up with a snazzy name for the assessment of individualised risk, FAIR. And so our group included a whole range of people. So we had donors and patients. We had all of the lobby groups who had been involved in lobbying within the UK. Probably more of them were England-based. I had colleagues across the UK, scientists, medics, and also key to this was our colleagues at the University of Nottingham, who you can see on the pitch there, Professor Eamon Ferguson, and my colleagues are Katie Davison and Claire Reynolds from the epidemiology team. So we made a start, it's probably early 2019, and the Department of Health were very keen that we kind of let them know how we were getting on. Of course, midway through, COVID happened, which kind of unsettled us slightly, but we kept on going. So in 2019, really the question was this going to be the right time? And for part of this work, we were looking at the general population and also our population of blood donors. And we thought it was a good time to do that because in terms of HIV in the general population and also within specific groups, so specifically MSM, this has been coming down year on year. And really, it was a good time. We were hitting the targets that the UN set. And we really thought, although MSM was still disproportionately affected by HIV, it was really the right time to go ahead. And the other data we looked at was our epidemiology data from our donors. We knew that really our rates of infection had been pretty stable year on year. We carry out post-donation discussions with all of our donors, so we knew a lot about where the risk was within that donor population. Our residual risk was stable. The only concern really that we've had and continues is really around syphilis, which is, although at a much lower level than in the general population, is reflecting what's going on across the UK and across many nations at the moment. So we were kind of keeping a very close eye on that, although we, as far as we know, it's not transfusion transmitted, but it's always a good marker of what's going on within sexual networks. And the other thing that we knew from the donor selection survey was that compliance was extremely high. So on the basis of what we knew from our epi of infections, we thought, yes, we should go forward with this. Of course, some of our challenges was how on earth were we going to do it? How were we going to identify these low and high risk sexual behaviours? And once we'd actually identified them, how was that going to work in terms of donor health check as it was then? And really, we were aware at the beginning that we needed to put together the epidemiology evidence, the behavioural evidence, and the psychology support around this to work out what were those questions going to be, were they going to be reliable and accurate, which is obviously going to be pretty key. Also, could people really answer them as fully as possible? Were they likely to have sort of their own perceptions of what we were asking them? Were they going to be acceptable? So were they going to be questions that could be carried out on session? We didn't want to end up with a donor health check that had 72 questions. It had to be something that was still practical and obviously accurate, as mentioned earlier. And it also had to be something that our current donors and our staff were really happy to engage in. So we kind of set ourselves a bit of a challenge as to that's kind of what we had to achieve. And really we had to make sure that we had suitable evidence to be able to do that. So in terms of the evidence, as I mentioned, we got lots of data on our bloodborne infections. So both the UK population, and then looking within our donor population, and specifically looking at our rates of newly acquired infections, which were low and remained low. So that's kind of our key, because those newly acquired infections are potentially the infections that we could risk on donation screening. It's so important that that remains low. So we had our evidence base for infections, and then we really looked at the literature around behaviour infections. So really, most of this was around acquisition of HIV. And there were just some key research studies that came out, and we tried to rank these in terms of really the strength of evidence. So the biggies being bacterial STIs in the last 12 months, chemsex, so basically having sex and using specific drugs, number of sexual partners, less frequent condom use, and obviously the types of sex that people are engaging with, and then sort of lower levels of evidence around clinic attendance, exclusivity of relationships, and new sexual partner was in there as well, although that was mainly because there were very few studies that were talking about that. Separately, as part of the BEST survey at the time, we also used that to look at our donors and look at risk behaviours to get an idea of if we were likely to introduce any of these more personal questions, would we lose many donors? But the other key bit was around psychosocial evidence, which was mainly carried out by our colleagues in Nottingham. So this was composed of surveys of UK staff and students, so that was across the 4 nations, focus groups with current donors, MSM, staff, and also some patients. And some of those focus groups also turned into more individualised interviews with patients. And as well as that, there was a large-scale survey of current donors. And this work, which was kind of done separately from the epidemiology work, was able to identify that there was 4 sexual behaviours which kind of clustered together. So if you had one of these behaviours, it's a good chance that you might also have one of the other ones. So as you can see there, STI diagnosis, chemsex, and knew a number of partners clustered together. So they were kind of the questions we thought were going to be our key questions going forward. And also really importantly, they were reliably reported and associated with self-reported high risk infections. So people were able to say, yeah, I think probably I'm at high risk here. But some of our concerns as well were about impression management, whether people would kind of give the right answer. So we knew we had to be a bit careful around that. And also the patients were kind of happy with this approach. They thought it was an acceptable, well, I'm not sure about an acceptable level of risk, but they felt that this was the right way to go. And accuracy of recall was high for those specific questions. There were some other questions that we looked at, particularly around condom use, and reliability was really poor. And that was something we spent quite a lot of time discussing, because the approach we went for initially not everybody was so keen on. But our qualitative work showed that really this matched well with the epidemiology. looking at potential to defer donors. We didn't think that that would have a huge impact. We could see that the questions were likely to be reliable. There were some concerns about specific questions, particularly around things like anal sex, but we thought we could manage that. But I think the loud and clear coming from all the focus groups was this would be a more equitable approach, and really everybody was very keen, including both the current donors and our donor carers, that this is the way forward. So we kind of got to the point where we got the epidemiology. We were quite happy with the rates of infection. We got good psychological information, and sort of linking that all together with the behaviour, we kind of knew what those key questions were. I think really all of this comes down to knowing your donors well. I'm not suggesting you could suddenly just lift this and use it in a different country. You really need to understand the epidemiology and the behaviours within your own country, knowing what those risks are, and also doing some work to make sure that this isn't likely to impact on your supply. So where we got to was decision to propose these question changes to SABTO. So specific questions around gonorrhea and clarifying our current question around syphilis, asking about chemsex, so use of drugs during sex, very specific drugs, not cannabis or other drugs that you're using for medical treatment. And also the question about, have you had sex with a new partner in the last 3 months, or sex with more than one partner? And if people said yes to that, then they'd be asked an additional question about anal sex. This is the point where we had lots of discussions about what should the additional question be, because there was no way that we could have just gone with that sex with a new partner or multiple partners, because we would have just lost so many donors, and it just seemed really too much of a blanket approach. So the additional question was around anal sex, but with the view that we would review that at a later date as we got further data. So as always with these things, we had a report that we put together, which was reviewed by SABTO, who then made recommendations to the 4 nations as health is devolved. These were accepted, and ministers announced that they were going to make the change it would be in the December. It was all a bit of a last minute scramble, but we were very happy with that. So after this was announced, we went on to do some further work, because we still had a question on our donor health check around people who'd had sex with somebody who'd had sex in Africa, or well, at least areas of the world where HIV was endemic, basically most countries in Africa for what we were using in the UK. And many people didn't like this question, were very offended by this question. And in England, we would invite partners of people to come in, they could have a test, but I think that probably offended people even more. So we wanted to look at this question and see whether we really still needed to have it in place. I mean, looking at the general population data, there really didn't seem to be any evidence to keep this question. So when we were changing the questions, we actually removed this question from our donor health check. And unfortunately, there was a bit of a delay before we could actually implement the policy, but we were able to do that eventually. So that's kind of where we were at. We were ready to implement, but there was obviously quite a lot of work to be done before that phase. And at that point, we got more involved with our marketing colleagues. Our communications colleagues had been involved from the very beginning. But our colleagues in donor experience, who you'll hear a bit more from Mark shortly, were also involved at this point. And we had a project team to really look at how this was going to work. So our lobby groups who had been involved from the beginning were really highly involved in this stakeholder engagement. There was quite a lot of new information provided on our BlooDHIT.co.uk website, and the other countries went with a similar approach, had a new check before you could give tool, lots of animations. The donor health check was rebranded as a donation safety check because we really wanted to emphasise this was about the patient, not just about the donor. All of our pre-donation information was updated, including our consent. And there was a sort of train-the-trainer approach to our staff training with lots of FAQs. And so that was against the background of COVID still going on, so it was all a bit hectic. I think one of the other key things was that our marketing was co-branded with the stakeholders who had been involved, which, given our previous relationship with some of our stakeholders, that was really quite a big deal. So some of the other considerations I think I have mentioned, certainly thinking about current donors and the impact on donor loss, but also we still have a deferral in place for PrEP and PEP. At the time, there was about to be a national review, which still hasn't quite concluded. So we decided we should keep that in place because of the potential to impact on our testing. As I said, as part of the project, we made a range of prepare to donate information pieces. And one big thing that we wanted to do, and also SABTO were insistent on, was to evaluate and review at 12 months to see how things have gone in terms of infections and donor loss and acceptability. So, England, Scotland and Wales went live on the 14th of June. Northern Ireland was slightly later. It was quite a sort of celebratory day really across all of the UK. I think everybody was decorating their donation sessions, had lots of media requests. Very much our charity groups led in terms of some of the television media, and also our chief nurse gave interviews. I kind of went to the radio a few times, probably haven't got the face for TV, but hey. And also there's a picture there of Xavier, who is one of our marketing people. And Xavier and his partner Oscar was on, I think they appeared on TV and on the radio, and I was on a radio call with them, so they were doing a grand job. And also the number of registrations we had went up a huge amount in that sort of week beforehand, and has still continued. It hasn't just been a big bang, there's been lots of work done by our colleagues in marketing to keep this going. And I think generally the staff were very happy. I think we had 2 complaints from donors, but we sort of braced ourselves in case we did get a lot of complaints. But really, I think we'd done quite a lot of pre-change work, that everybody knew what was coming, and were really very positive about the whole change. So obviously there's quite a lot of epidemiology and infectious disease monitoring going on. We've always done a lot of monitoring, but we tried to make this a bit more real time than we had previously. We have a regular MDT every week where we go through all our donors with markers of infections, look at what their risks are, just check that their compliance isn't kind of going a bit astray and could have been impacted by FAIR. We've also done some other work looking at sort of the surveillance across the UK, and some work on session really to look at the views of people attending. And as I said, we're about to actually put a report into SABTO. But just looking at the UK monitoring, the graphs aren't very big, but the main take-home message is that there hasn't been an impact on new donors or regular donors. Our regular donors we're going to keep a close eye on, because obviously people are only just coming through and turning into regular donors. But we certainly haven't seen any impact on newly acquired infections. Our residual risk rates have stayed the same. And although this is kind of the wrong end of the chain, if you like, we haven't had any reported viral transmissions in any way in relation to FAIR. So the other pieces of work were around acceptance and compliance. So these were carried out by the University of Nottingham, both looking at people on session. They were directed to the short survey, looked at some focus groups with donors, non-donors, and also staff. And also there was some work with patients to see how they felt about the change. But we were able to see from the monitoring on session that we have had an increase in the number of MSM. The more general survey of donors was all very positive. Our staff were very happy that they were now seeing more MSM coming through to donate, and felt that it had been well received by all the donors. And as I mentioned, there were very few complaints. When we were doing the work with the patients, it was that they were kind of presented with, this is what's happened, and it was quite clear that some of the patients hadn't realised there'd been a change, and they were they were not unhappy, but they were more anxious about this change. So I think we realised there probably needs to be a bit more work there done. Because I think we did some work early on, but I think we probably need some more work around patients. And we also became aware that we have had a couple of complaints from polyamorous groups who feel they've now been excluded from donation. Other things planned are a large-scale compliance survey, which hopefully will be next year, and also we're hoping to do an audit of who have actually been deferred, because although Scotland and Wales were able to look at their deferrals, they've had very small numbers of deferrals. We haven't got just one code where we're able to see the impact of change, so we are going to have to do an audit of our donation safety checks. But certainly in Scotland and in Wales, they introduced some pre-assessment before people actually got to session. And I think out of something like 175,000 donors, they had 174 deferrals based on these questions. So really, impact change, we have undergoing our regular reviews. We are regularly looking at surveillance data. We've done some more qualitative work. And this is very much the sort of start of a journey. We've got some additional work to do looking at PrEP and PEP, also some issues around partners. Since the blood donor work, we've also looked at tissues and cells, and we're just waiting for SABTO to make a recommendation to ministers around that. But really, I think, hopefully, we've shown that we can use this evidence-based approach to recommend a more individualised risk-based donor selection. The importance of psychology and behavioural science in this, and also really focusing on patient safety, making messaging really clear, maybe broaching subjects that we didn't really want to broach in the past. The importance really of stakeholders being with you the whole way through. And I think this has had a sort of a wider effect, not just specifically on the donors. I think across the organisation we feel a bit more sort of positive about our whole approach really when it comes to LGBTQ plus issues. So there's a link there to more information and some of the marketing information if you're interested. And just really to put in context where we were, where we've come. It's taken a while, but we're here. And that's it. Thank you.
Apologies.
You are? I didn't want to show you.
I think I'm loud enough without a microphone. Thank you so very much, Sue. That was very interesting. Any questions? We are running short of time, but we have time for one or two questions. Ellen, please.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was amazing. Tell me, compliance is so important. And what can you actually do to make sure, as best as possible, that people do comply?
I think that mostly people are coming to do a good thing. They're not out there to fib or anything. I think a lot of it is about people understanding why on earth you're asking them all these ridiculous questions that they answer every time they come, and really the importance of the patient in this whole piece. I mean, that was something that came out loud and strong in the focus groups that we did. So I think that's the key, information and keep reminding people.
Okay.
Actually, there's something that Mark can probably answer later on. But.
Okay, and tell me, I know you have more planned. You're doing a review on PrEP and PEP. And what else is down the line for individual donor risk assessment?
Well, I think there's also my colleague, Heli Havala, has got some further work to do. We really want to look at other viruses. Also, Heli's doing some work on PrEP and PEP. We quite like to go back and revisit condom use because that was something that was not great the last time, but I think that might be something that we really want to look at again, and also some of the issues around people who have partners who are on HIV medication, and polyamory as well, which could be a bit tricky. But
okay, I'd never thought of polyamorous people until you mentioned it, but yes, thank you very much, Sue.
okay, thanks.
I may ask a question myself, I'd like to say fair play to the first hearing group.
Oh, very good.
And it's interesting that you got an increase in the numbers of your MSM donors, and that was not followed by an increase in TTIs, which is very reassuring. My question is, did you see this increase across all ethnic groups, or specifically did donors from particular minority ethnic groups feel less confident to contribute?
So we're still kind of looking at some of this data, but if I remember rightly, I think I don't think there were huge numbers of people who didn't identify as kind of white British, but I think, and we did try to weight the data as well, but I don't think there was any specific differences, but that might just be about numbers. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much.